And here I am in recorded mode. Today we'll look at the earliest history of swing dancing, mostly before the 1930s, before the swing era. So where did swing dance come from? You might say that swing dancing came from the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. Okay, the Savoy was important, but that doesn't go back far enough. Rarely, if ever, does the dance materialize from nothing. Dances change, they merge, travel across the country or around the world, and they branch off to create new forms. Dances evolve. What did swing dancing evolve from? Importantly, swing dancing is an African American creation, which you probably already knew. You might not know that it was created in San Francisco around 1910, before it migrated to Harlem. That story is coming up. But what were the elements that were combined to create it? And where did those elements come from? Well, if you've heard my talks on swing dancing before, I have some new information, which I've been researching in the past year. Before we get into that, we must define what we mean by swing dancing. We have to do this because there were two different definitions of swing dancing. One from the swing era, the 1930s, and the other is what swing dancing means today. Originally, swing dancing simply meant dancing to swing music, which was new in the 1930s. And that included several different social dances. During the swing era, the 30s, the foxtrot was the dance that most people, black or white, danced, with some shag and Big Apple. And yes, a very small percentage of Americans were dancing Lindy Hop and Jitterbug in the 1930s, but mostly swing dancing started to spread across the country and around the world in the 1940s. But that's a long story in itself, with many examples. Then definition two. Swing dancing is an improvised social dance form where you hold a partner's hand in what we call swing out position, and the leads send their partners through a wide variety of underarm turns and twirls, and occasionally coming together in closed dance position, jitterbugging. And that's the definition I'll be using in my talk today when I talk about swing dancing, the evolution of that kind of a dance. Perhaps we should call it swing out dancing. How did that dance form evolve? And then one more preliminary definition, since this is the Stockton Winter Folk Dance Weekend. The definition of folk dance. You probably already know, but it doesn't hurt to mention it, that folk dance doesn't necessarily mean a rural or a village dance form. A folk dance is a dance that was created by the folk process. This means evolving in a grassroots manner from ordinary people, instead of being created by professional dancing masters. Another term for it is vernacular dance, vernacular as in slang, common folk usage. And some folk dances are urban folk dances, like the Argentine tango, originally from the slums surrounding Buenos Aires. Swing dancing definitely fits the definition of a folk dance, an urban folk dance. It is often argued that swing dancing is our country's most significant folk dance, which has spread all over the world and is still very popular today. Now, I don't want to digress into the debate about square dancing, which was once strongly lobbied to be called America's official folk dance. But square dancing is essentially just our style of dancing the European quadrille. Swing dancing is an American original. Hey, do you know where I first learned swing dancing? Well, back in the 1970s, I only knew international folk dance, contra dancing, and historical dance. No swing dancing. Our folk dance leader, Dave Fankhauser, invited the legendary Dick Crum to lead a weekend workshop. For his Sunday morning class, he said that if a Martian landed and said, "I hear you teach folk dancing, show me your folk dance," well, I would have to say, well, my folk dance would be swing dancing. That's what I danced in high school. And for him, that would have been the mid-1940s. And Dick Crum proceeded to teach us a class in six-count swing. I remember finding that six-count timing against four-count music to be very confusing at first. So yes, swing dancing is a true American folk dance. Okay, as we now get into the early history of swing dancing, an important aspect of any history is the cultural context, even the way of thinking of a culture. So I would like to begin with that. An important part of this story is recalling ways that American dancing is unique. For the past century now, Americans have emphasized creative personal expression in our dancing, along with the informal borrowing of steps from one dance into another, known as crossover. Now, this American independence, that was a newfound spirit in the 20th century, because innovation had not always been a characteristic of American social dance. Back in the 19th century, Americans emulated European prototypes and did their best to dance and dress in the styles of Paris and London. They were painfully aware that Europeans considered them to be rough-hewn and socially unskilled. And this changed at the beginning of a new century, with a prevailing sentiment to make a clean break from the past and be progressive. The lore of American pioneers of the Wild West, with their independence and freedom, that was popular at that time. So Americans grew less embarrassed about their differences from European culture and increasingly proud of their uniqueness. Americans were also becoming comfortable with their identity as a melting pot of diverse cultural influences. Okay, that was a lot of background, but all of that is an important foundation to the story of swing dancing. So at the beginning of my talk, I asked what were the elements that were combined to create swing dancing, and where did those elements come from? So the three essential elements are the music, the footwork, and the swing out concept. Let's talk about music first. As America was a melting pot of diverse cultural influences, this included the new ragtime music, which appeared in the mid-1890s. As you probably know, ragtime music is a synthesis of European and African influences, innovated by African Americans. At that time, ragtime music was well known to have African American origins, and this was seen as a positive quality at the time. I have read many newspaper and magazine articles from that time period acknowledging or praising the musicality of Black composers and musicians. The United States was still segregated, but the admiration of Black music was an important early step in improving race relations in this country. And coming up soon, the admiration and adoption of African American dances. But music was first. Now, importantly, in the evolution of swing dancing, ragtime music was more rhythmic and more syncopated than previous dance music. Ragtime music was described at that time as, quote, imparting a rhythmic compulsion to the body, which is nothing short of irresistible, close quote. Well, I could talk for another hour about ragtime music, but I have a lot to cover. So onto the second element of a dance form, the footwork. You might not guess from which dance swing dance footwork directly evolved. It was the polka. Now, as you recall, if you watched my talk yesterday, the polka was from Bohemia, Czech Republic today, and it was the largest dance craze in the 19th century, by far, even outshining the waltz, with a huge polka mania sweeping Western Europe and this country in 1844. Now, new information. The polka wasn't just a dance step. It was 4 basic categories of steps, and this is important. They were the basic polka step, the gallop or chassé, and pivots, as in the Bohemian National Polka, if you know that dance, and heel motions or stamps, as in the heel and toe polka. I mention Bohemian National Polka because that dance is based on the research of the Czech dance historian František Boniš, who discovered in ancient Prague sources that all 4 of these steps were in the original polka. So the polka is actually a family of steps. Later in time, if we see a new dance come along that has just one of those 4, that just might be a coincidence, not a correlation. But if it has all 4 of these categories, we can be more certain that it evolved from the polka. The Brazilian social version of the samba is a good example. As it was first described in 1923 by the Brazilian dancer Duke, it had a basic step, which was a bouncy 2-step, gallop, chassés, pivots, and a heel and toe movement, but in an Africanized swaying style. So samba is essentially Africanized polka, Africanized in Brazil. then spreading to Europe and North America. But returning back to the 19th century, the polka was a very bouncy dance. But then women's fashions changed the polka around 1860. The original 1844 ball gowns had several soft layers of petticoats under the skirt there. Men described it as dancing into a soft cloud of petticoats. Then, during the 1850s, more and more petticoats were added as wider and wider skirts became fashionable and problematic as the weight of each additional layer of petticoat that became too heavy. So the solution came from engineering, the hooped petticoat. It solved that problem, but it created another. Hoops swayed like a bell in the bouncy dances like the polka, exposing a lady's ankle. So the solution to that problem was to smooth out the polka so that it was no longer bouncy. And that was the new polka for the remainder of the century. The smooth version wasn't really technically a polka with a hop, so it picked up a newer name, the two-step, in the 1870s. Now, trust me, this really is a part of the evolution of swing dancing. No dance comes from nowhere. In the mid-19th century, during a huge dance craze, the polka was one of many dances that were done at a ball. All of these and more. Then, as the decades passed, this variety started fading, with dances dying off one by one. That is, no longer being popular. So that by the end of the century, the 1890s, most of the turning couple dances had disappeared, leaving primarily just the waltz and the two-step. These are typical ball cards from then. And as many dancing masters pointed out at that time, those two were essentially the same dance. Smooth turning, either in triple or duple time. So the 1890s brings us up to the ragtime era. And what dance step do you suppose most Americans were dancing to ragtime music? Yes, of course, the two-step. Blacks did, whites did, young and old, urban and rural. Now, to clarify, the two-step was danced to many kinds of music, not just ragtime. Here is a ball placard in my collection which shows that. These were displayed above a band back at the time. The two-step was seen as the new dance of the 1890s to 1910, not the waltz. That was seen as old. The quadrille was seen as older. The one-step, that was still 10 years away. The two-step was a popular dance of the day for everyone. It was so popular that in 1894, the American National Association of Masters of Dancing renamed their monthly professional magazine the Two-Step Magazine, a name which they kept for 25 years. The two-step was so popular that it evolved into several dances in the 20th century. I already mentioned the Brazilian samba, and American dancers evolved the two-step into both the one-step and the foxtrot. In fact, the two-step was my dad's favorite go-to foxtrot step. Now, the two-step had many regional variations and styles, like any vernacular tradition. And significantly, African Americans in San Francisco's Barbary Coast began to dance the two-step in a unique way around 1910. They had their own new style. They bounce like human jackhammers and added kick steps off to the side, calling it the Texas Tommy or the Texas Tommy swing. The Texas Tommy. What was that dance? Actually, to me and other dance historians back then, that was a huge mystery. For decades, we didn't know. 60 years ago, the oldest of the old-timers told interviewers that the Lindy Hop and swing dancing came from a dance called the Texas Tommy from San Francisco, but none of those old-timers described it very well. Oh, they said that it was a kick and a hop about 3 times on each foot, followed by a slide. Oh, that's not a dance description. Another said that you let go of your partner to a single handhold. And that's not much of a description either. And there was not a single description of any actual footwork. Then the old-timers passed away, leaving behind nothing but questions. What did the Texas Tommy look like? What did it evolve from? What does San Francisco have to do with Harlem and swing dancing? And then, one by one, the answers started appearing. Importantly, a silent film was discovered, sealed in a canister and unseen for almost a century. in the Prelinger archives. A tourist with a movie camera was roaming the streets of San Francisco around 1910 and happened to catch a black couple dancing a dance that turned out to be the Texas Tommy out in the street there, to the accompaniment of bystanders clapping the rhythm. And then that man with a movie camera filmed a different couple dancing a slightly different style in an indoor dance hall with a brass band in the background. And we can now see the footwork. And it's especially interesting. There are 4 different kinds of steps in the Texas Tommy. And yes, you probably already guessed it. This new style of the ragtime two-step was still a member of the polka family, evolving now in a new direction. The lineage is clear. The polka step is there in the Texas Tommy in an African-American chicken scratch style, and the gallop is there, and pivots, and a step where they kick their heel off to the side. They're all variations of the polka and two-step, but now with a bouncier style and with swing outs. The Texas Tommy was, in essence, Africanized polka, Africanized in San Francisco. Was it fun? Yes. Was it easy? No, not at all. The dancers had to constantly change from one of those 4 steps to another, which is quite difficult to follow on the fly. Then, in order to spin and throw out to swing out position, they had to switch to pivot steps. That's also hard to do. So hold on to this thought, because an important part of the evolution of a dance form is problem solving. And that was the main problem with the Texas Tommy, a problem that would be solved. Now, here's another important observation. Half of those steps traveled, as the two-step did, and half of those were done in place. If you thought that Charleston was the first 20th century social dance to be danced on one spot, think 15 years earlier. But note that it was only occasionally danced on the spot. The Texas Tommy could also travel during the gallop and pivot steps. Today's swing dancing is primarily danced on one spot, without traveling around the room. So in the evolution of dance forms, from the constantly traveling polka to the stationary swing dancing, the Texas Tommy was a transition phase, partially traveling and partially danced in place. Okay, let's watch the film clip from the Prelinger archives. This first clip was stabilized and colorized. And those making costume notes might want to notice that she's wearing culottes or palazzo pants in 1910. It's a silent film, of course. There's that kick off to the side. Step, kick, tandem position, see later in swing, a face loop. Now he has to hold her in a different position to get to a change of a step to a polka step. And then here's a gallop traveling along. And there's pivot steps. Brief little swing out catcher again. And back to the basics, kicking to the side step. Double underarm turn. A simple underarm turn that time. Here is the second dance scene, indoors. The nitrate film was too badly deteriorated to stabilize and colorize, so this is the original. You will see the man occasionally swing his partner out to swing out position, and then at the end, bring her back in with her hand behind her back. Later in Lindy Hop, that figure would be known as the Texas Tommy figure. Pivoting lots in this one. He lets her go, brings her back in. We need a dog nipping at their feet. Here's a barrel roll a couple of times, and a back-to-back position. Again, he has to hold her differently to head into the pivots. And notice the shadows from sunlight that will be coming up later. Tandem position again with this couple, ending with a face loop again, but other variations and styles are different from that first couple. And he brings her in with her hand behind her back. Now, the Texas Tommy would have been just a kicking polka step, not at all like swing dancing, without the swing out figure. That's what made it the first swing dance, along with it continuing to evolve directly into the Lindy Hop. So this is element number 3, the swing out figure. So where did that come from? Well, I used to think that it came from the French Apache dance, and here's why. The Apache dance notably premiered in Paris in 1908, and the Apache dance was, to quote Irene Castle, a dance where the male dancer tried to demolish the female dancer as spectacularly as possible and usually succeeded, close quote. This photo from 1908 shows Miss Tenguet, who created this dance. Yes, even though the Apache looks like violence against a woman, it was created by a woman. So to make a long story short, the reason why I thought there was a direct relationship between the Apache and the Texas Tommy is that one of the swing-out figures was identical. Here it is in an early filmed version of the Texas Tommy performed in New York. Then you'll see another filmed Texas Tommy that I'll explain later. And then in many Apache dances. So here is the 1915 Texas Tommy in New York. And now in the Apache, many Apache scenes. Now, in the Apache dance, the reason for this very unusual and painful-looking figure is because it was supposed to look painful. Miss Tenguet was portraying the man as a brute, treating women roughly. So, to clarify something, dancers have been turning under raised arms for centuries, but usually in an obvious way, with the follow going forward under the lead's raised arm. So, therefore, if in the Baroque era, a follow turns clockwise under the lead's raised arm in an allemande, and then you see the same turn a century later in an 1844 polka, that does not necessarily mean that the polka got it from the allemande. Or same in the simple underarm turns that you saw in the Texas Tommy. It's such an obvious move that it has occurred to dancers many times over the centuries. But then a downright weird swing-up move appeared in the Apache dance and the Texas Tommy. The man placed the woman's right arm behind her back, reached around with his free right hand until he was holding right to right hands behind her back, like a wrestling hammerlock. Then she spun out to extended arms, still holding right to right hands, then wound back into closed position. I will call that the hammerlock swing out. So when we see something that extremely counterintuitive in two different dances at about the same time period, then we can be fairly confident that the figures were related. Here is Miss Tenguet dancing her original Apache, and here is the Texas Tommy, now being done by white dancers in 1911 in a newspaper article, and the connection seemed clear. Or rather, that's what I used to think. But a couple of problems. One, I think the timing is too close for it to travel from a performance in Paris in 1908, and it took a couple of years for it to start spreading, to going to African Americans in San Francisco only 2 years later. I don't think so. Fads and trends traveled more slowly back then. And two, there is a far more likely source for this seemingly brutal hammerlock swing-out figure that dates back to the United States in the late 19th century. And it likely was picked up by both the Apache and the Texas Tommy, meaning there probably still is a direct connection here between the Apache dance and the Texas Tommy. But it's because they both got the figure from the same earlier dance. So here is that story. The earlier forerunner that I'm referring to is the Bowery Waltz, or Bowery Dance, also called the Ruffian Dance, Spieling, the Hoboken Swing-O, and the Tough Dance. It was a very rough waltz from the late 19th century, and like the Apache dance, it was created as a theatrical entertainment in a vaudeville tradition. Now, vaudeville acts included very talented performers, of course, in all kinds of entertainments. And also, back then, a very common vaudeville act was a comic skit that satirized an ethnicity, or a race, or a social class, with extreme stereotypical characterizations. The targeted populations included Jews, Irish and Italian immigrants, African Americans, hillbillies and farmers, and in this case, the very poor and uneducated denizens of the Bowery district of New York City. and Hoboken, New Jersey, right across from the river from Manhattan. So these vaudeville skits usually exaggerated some characteristics of the targeted class to an extreme degree, which the audience back then found amusing. I think it's one of the least admirable qualities of humans to find humor in others' misfortune or wanting to feel that other people are inferior to them. But maybe when some people are feeling low about themselves, they tend to find comfort in seeing others portrayed as even worse than they are. So some of vaudeville's crude humor was based on that dynamic. And those dance routines sometimes ended up in musical theater as well. So, what was the Bowery Waltz? As mentioned, it was a staged performance, first seen in the 1891 Broadway musical comedy A Trip to Chinatown, which featured a tough dance to the waltz song The Bowery, which became a quite famous song. I remember that on TV shows when I was a kid. A Trip to Chinatown wasn't some obscure play that I dug up. It was the longest running musical comedy to that date, and then it toured widely across the country. It was seen by and influenced many people and many vaudeville performers. Now, back to the Apache. That dance was a complete fiction. It was based on the Apache street gangs in Paris, but there was never an instance of an Apache thug choreographically abusing a woman in real life. Never. That idea was completely made up by Mistinguett. But in the case of the Bowery Waltz, there was a real prototype, going back a dozen years earlier. Last summer, I traced it back to the 1870s. At that time, a very rough form of waltzing was called spieling. An 1879 newspaper article described Irish immigrants in Hoboken waltzing in, quote, a spieler style, unreasonable and improper close proximity between the sexes, and hugging and squeezing, close quote. Similar reports appeared throughout the 1880s, then became more notable in the 1890s. Here's an 1890 description of the class of people in the Bowery as, quote, the most foul-mouthed loafers and rowdies and dirty-talking and obscene spielers and female toughs that could be met with in the lowest of the slums of the metropolis, close quote. These are some of the Bowery series postcards that I have. And here is a description of their waltzing from the next year. Quote, the young man pivots his partner by holding his position on the floor, tripping her and swinging her. Her skirts are kept flying if the waltz is lively, and glimpses of ankles are unavoidable. Then the young man projects his chin over his partner's left shoulder. Close quote. Note the pivoting. The illustration at the right is from a tobacco felt. And I mentioned spieling and Hoboken earlier. So that's the dance that was portrayed in the 1891 longest running Broadway musical that toured around the country, even being performed in Germany. Songs were written about it. And this led to a series of many spin-off vaudeville acts like Lawrence and Harrington as the original Bowery Boy and his Tough Girl, or the DeForests as the Bowery Spielers, or acts simply listed as the Tough Dance or the Ruffian Dance, mixed in with all of the other vaudeville acts. Next came a tough dance scene in the 1897 Broadway musical The Belle of New York. This time, the man was even rougher and a bit violent. And very importantly, both versions were filmed. The first, the earlier version that I described in that newspaper article, that was filmed by the Thomas A. Edison Manufacturing Company in 1897 as the Bowery Waltz. It was a very short film clip in which the man tripped his partner and swung her like a rag doll. And then the dancers leaned forward into each other. Quote, the young man projects his chin over his partner's left shoulder. So here it is. Notice that this version is not violent. Those early descriptions were not. They were just portraying a very uncouth and low-class way of waltzing. Now, the second clip was filmed by the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company in 1902 as the Tough Dance. And this would be the one from the Belle of New York, the more violent version. In this scene, the man swings his partner through the hammerlock figure, which was repeated 5 more times. Now, keep in mind, this was 6 years before the French Apache dance had that same exact hammerlock swing out figure, repeated like that. And like the Bowery waltz, the Apache was also a waltz. And that film was 8 years before the Texas Tommy incorporated that figure. So now you know why I think the Bowery waltz, the tough dance, is the more likely origin of that very counterintuitive hammerlock swing out figure in both the Texas Tommy and the Apache dance. Okay, that thread was a tangent off the main story for those who like to get into those kind of details or hear something they've never heard before. So let's return to the core story. We were in San Francisco's Barbary Coast around 1910. So what was the Barbary Coast? That was the name given to the infamous red light district of San Francisco that was surrounding a 3-block-long stretch of Pacific Street, now Pacific Avenue near Montgomery, shown here in the 1910s. Photos courtesy of opensfhistory.org. Pacific Street was lined with saloons, dance halls, and houses of prostitution until it was cleaned up by a progressive mayor beginning in 1913. It's located right here on this 1910 map. In this book in my collection, The Barbary Coast, written by Herbert Ashbury in 1933, now this was only about 20 years after the Texas Tommy, so the stories were fresh back then. And some of the many San Franciscans that he interviewed said that the Texas Tommy was first danced in Purcell's Dance Hall, also called the So Different, shown here in the 1910s. It was an African-American owned dance hall with mostly black patronage, but integrated. You see two African-Americans conversing with a white man in front. So the film clip that we saw might have been filmed at Purcell's. It was also reported that the most famous Texas Tommy dancer, Johnny Peters, danced there and at the nearby Thalia. So maybe that was him in the film. Here is that building today, mostly unchanged. 3 doors down was the other dance hall where the Texas Tommy was reportedly danced, the Thalia. And here you can see the posters for the Salome and the Texas Tommy dance, advertised as the finest entertainment, meaning they were performed there. Now, the Thalia address was 514 and a half Pacific, between two buildings, as you can see. So if therefore it was an outdoor space between the buildings, then I think that film clip, which was a performance, was more likely filmed at the Thalia because it looks like it's in the sunlight. So where did the name Texas Tommy come from? Well, no one knows. But since Tommy was a nickname for a prostitute then, and this was the red light district, that's one possible name origin. But we don't know. And the dance itself is not from Texas. Now, as time moves on and the Texas Tommy dance evolves, let's review the 3 main elements of the Texas Tommy. The new African-American music, quote, imparting a rhythmic compulsion to the body, which is nothing short of irresistible. And the swing-out figures, which also did include simple underarm turns, as you saw, and the complicated footwork. The Bowery, or the tough dance, had done the hammerlock figure with easier waltz step throughout, as did the Apache. But the Barbary Coast dancers were using the ragtime 2-step, and in that family of steps, the best step for spinning is pivoting. And as I mentioned, it was difficult to shift gears, so to speak, from one of the 4 kinds of steps into another. So it's the footwork that evolved forward in Harlem. So how did the Texas Tommy get from San Francisco to Harlem? Well, that we know. In 1911, the most famous black Texas Tommy dancer, Johnny Peters, took a train from San Francisco to New York City. And that meant Harlem back then if you were black. There he performed the Texas Tommy with Ethel Williams. New York loved the new step. It appeared in the Darktown Follies, which was Harlem's vaudeville. The Texas Tommy Dancers, you can read the marquee, biggest and best show in Harlem. Then it hit big time, the Ziegfeld Follies, that same year, 1911. Many people in show business at that time added the Texas Tommy to their act. Vernon and Irene Castle did. Irene said that they performed the Texas Tommy in Paris the following year, 1912. Another vaudeville dance team was the young brother and sister act of Fred and Adele Astaire. Fred was just 14 years old then, but he had been performing on stage for almost a decade by then as a child star. Many dancers in New York vaudeville added the Texas Tommy to their act in 1911. I mention this because 28 years later, in 1939, Fred Astaire was cast to play the role of Vernon Castle in an RKO film, The Story of Vernon and Irene Castle, with Ginger Rogers playing Irene. In one of the scenes, it's an audition with Vernon and Irene showing a dance to the impresario Lou Fields in 1911. Incidentally, Lou Fields played himself in that movie 28 years after the actual audition. I'll show you that scene, and you will recognize their dance as the very same as that 1910 San Francisco clip. The same basic step with the heel scuff off to the side, same back-to-back position, that trademark Texas Tommy arm behind her back hammerlock figure, and pivots. And you can see it all more clearly than in that deteriorating silent film. And then in the big picture of what the Texas Tommy evolved from, it's all clearly built upon the polka. Here it is. Fred Astaire contributed many of the choreographies and dance reconstructions to that film from his memory of dancing when he was 14. So that scene is an accurate Texas Tommy, danced as Fred Astaire remembered doing it, only 28 years earlier. Why do I say only 28 years? Because it's like you remembering a dance that you performed many times in 1998, right? It's not that long ago. Now, in that scene in the movie, the actors don't call that dance anything by name. They just danced it. So how do we know that that dance scene is a Texas Tommy, besides recognizing all of the figures? Well, besides all of those similarities to the 1910 silent film, I have RKO's publicity for that film. And we see that it is indeed called the Texas Tommy, as shown here and here. So then of all of these 10 steps and figures, which figure was actually the Texas Tommy figure? Yep, the hammerlock swing out, the one borrowed from the Bowery dance. Now, the Texas Tommy never caught on as a social dance. I think because it was so hard to follow the changes from one of the 4 kind of steps to the other. It worked best as a rehearsed exhibition, when the follower knew when to change the step timing. That's what simplified in Harlem in the 1920s at the Savoy Ballroom. The Savoy opened at the peak of the huge Charleston craze, 1926. Speaking of which, here is a short digression. The Charleston dance was created for an all-black musical called Runnin' Wild. James P. Johnson was the songwriter and was busy dashing off one new song after the other for the musical. One of those songs happened to be named Charleston, and it needed a dance routine to go along with it. So do you think they sent a research team to Charleston, South Carolina to see what they danced there? No, they couldn't halt a production to do dance research. The choreographer of the Charleston was Elida Webb, and she said where she got the dance from. Later, in interviews, she said that she saw black dock workers doing that movement in New York City. So she had her team of men in the show do that step. And where did the dock workers get it? Well, we can't know with certainty, but it happens to be almost the same as the Texas Tommy basic step, which we know was being done in New York then, but simplified. I'll show that to you in a few minutes. Okay, back to our main story. We know with certainty that the Lindy Hop evolved from the Texas Tommy. In an interview 60 years ago, Ethel Williams, who had performed the Texas Tommy with Johnny Peters, stated that fact. Other old-timers said the same thing. And it's quite obvious just by seeing the many similarities. So, what do they call this new version of the Texas Tommy at the Savoy Ballroom? Well, the legendary Savoy Ballroom dancer, Norma Miller, told me that when the Savoy Ballroom first opened, they lived in an apartment directly opposite the back of the Savoy. And at the beginning, the Savoy only had two dances, the one-step and the two-step. Now, Norma was only 7 at the time. She's on the right in this even earlier photo with her older sister Dottie. But she remembered her mother coming back saying that she was dancing the one-step and the two-step at the Savoy. But this two-step wasn't the White's ragtime two-step, the smooth polka. It was a jackhammer bouncing spinning dance, dance on one spot with swing outs. In fact, it was essentially the Texas Tommy 15 years later. And their earlier roots are quite recognizable. Now, a lot can change in 15 years, but the Texas Tommy style of two-step actually didn't change that much. Now, most dances simplify as they become more popular, and so did the Texas Tommy. As time moved on, the dancers in Harlem simplified Texas Tommy's 4 kinds of steps to just 2. A modified two-step, and the side kicks of the Texas Tommy became a second kind of step, now kicking forward and back. The gallop and the chicken scratch polka disappeared. And those swing outs were now done with the modified two-step, no longer needing to switch to pivot steps. That's all. Not much of a change, but clearly an improvement. Much easier to lead and follow. With the simplified footwork, attention could now focus on the swing-out variations, and a series of new figures began to develop. Okay, I'll demonstrate the steps. Here is the Texas Tommy step.
1 and heel, 1 and heel, 1 and heel, 1 and heel.
And here's just the basic weight change of the Texas Tommy step, the essence of that step. And you'll see that maybe that's where the Charleston came from. Remember, the original choreographer said she saw it being done by black dock workers in New York.
Left and tap. That's your left foot first, just for practice. Now, what I'd like you to do instead is step, tap forward, step, tap back, step and tap. Add a little bit of a double bounce. Bouncy, bounce, bum, yum, bum, bum, yum, bum, bum, yum, bum, bum. And step and kick, or swing it forward.
Yes, the kicking Charleston step was done exactly that way in the original 1920s Lindy Hop. Okay, let's go back to the basic weight change of the Texas Tommy step, and that was modified into this version.
Left and tap. That's your left foot first, just for practice. A left, a rock step, right, rock step, left, a rock step, right, rock step.
And that's the basic step of the 1920s Lindy Hop. And the beauty of this modification, what really made this dance functional, is that that same step could be done spinning without having to change the pivot steps. Here it is.
A left, a rock step, right, rock step, left, a rock step, right, rock step.
And swing outs could now be done with a spinning step without having to change to pivot steps. That is much easier to follow.
And in, 2, 3 away, and in, zump, bum, bum.
Okay, now back to our story. The first leader of the best dancers at the Savoy Ballroom was George Snowden, shown here, nicknamed Shorty George because he was really short. At a 1928 dance marathon, he was famously asked by a reporter what he called the dance they were doing. And instead of calling it the two-step, he gave it a new name, Lindy Hop. Now, there's a debate today about whether that was named after Charles Lindbergh, and that is the most common story, or the very popular black pet name for a young woman at that time, Lindy, or Lindy Lou. So the man hopped his Lindy. Now, please don't quote that as Richard Powers' theory. That's from Kristen Batchelor. I'm just passing that on for your consideration, since it has some merit. Personally, I don't need to take a side in that debate, but you should know about both possibilities, despite the predominance of the Charles Lindbergh story, which might be true. And then, the next year, very fortunately, their dancing was filmed. for a race film, as they were called at that time, and that meant films made for black audiences. After Seven was a film released in 1929, possibly filmed in late 1928, the same year it was named Lindy Hop. Instead of choreographing and training dancers for the dance competition scene, they just brought in Shorty Snowden's dancers, along with the Savoy Ballroom's house band, the Chick Webb Orchestra. This is a sound film, only 2 years after the very first sound film ever. And at that same time, Charlie Chaplin and others were still making silent films. So we are very fortunate to have a sound film of the original Lindy Hop. And for swing dancers watching this who are wondering whether the original Lindy Hop was 8 count or 6 count, you will see that the first couple begins with 8 count figures, but they finish with 6 count timing. So both 8 count and 6 count existed from the year that it was named Lindy Hop. You saw that each of the three couples had a unique style, different from the other two couples. Same with the two Texas Tommy couples that we watched earlier. Even their timing of the basic Lindy Hop step is different. Couples 2 and 3 dance slow, quick, quick, side step first. Couple number 1 dance quick, quick, slow, rock step first. The difference is quite clear, being a sound film. Next, if you happen to know some Lindy Hop, you might be thinking, okay, the 1920s Lindy does look rather like the earlier Texas Tommy, but how is this like Frankie Manning's 1930s Lindy Hop? Good question, and it has a good answer. Let me show you. This is exactly what couple number 1 did, a swing out with a rock step on count 1.
A rock step catch, paddle around, rock step.
And then when swing music became a bit slower and, well, swingier, they replaced the slow step with a triple step, which matched that energy exactly. So here is that same swing out substituting a triple step for the slow step, meaning instead of rock step step, quick, quick, slow, it's now rock step, triple step. But the figure itself and the dance itself is the same.
Yeah, a rock, 2, catch and 2, paddle and 7 and 8, 1, 2.
And if you were wondering what the Texas Tommy figure looks like in today's Lindy Hop, here it is. Finishing with Nick and Melissa Enga, and then by Frankie Manning at the age of 93, dancing with Dawn Hampton. Well, as I'm finishing up my talk, I'd like to go back and revisit the significance of Johnny Peters taking the Texas Tommy to Harlem in 1911. Now, as a dance historian, I've seen over and over that most new dances never catch on. In thousands of instances, a person or a culture created something new, a few people see it, maybe it had a brief life of popularity, and then it disappeared. In fact, the Texas Tommy did die out in San Francisco in only a few years, never to be seen there again. It was random chance that one man, Johnny Peters, happened to take it to Harlem, where it found a large African American community at the very beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, where it could evolve into a more functional version and eventually evolve and explode into a worldwide social dance form. But if that one man had not taken that trip, that would not have happened, and we would not have swing dancing as we know it. What a difference one decision can make. Okay, my time's about up. The evolution of swing dancing did continue, of course, through the 1930s, then really taking off in the 1940s. And some of you watched my talk on what 1950s teenagers contributed to swing dancing, and those stories are also interesting. I could talk for an hour about big band swing music as it evolved. I would love to go into depth on the differences between cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation and the human capability to be inspired by other humans, regardless of race. And the evolution of West Coast swing. That's a fascinating story. But I only had 50 minutes, so I hope you found these stories of the earliest years of swing dancing to be interesting.